Zipporah, Moses' first wife, is an often overlooked biblical figure whose actions played a crucial role in Moses' mission and God's covenant plan. When people speak about the story of Moses, they often focus on burning bushes, parted seas, and divine commandments carved in stone. Rarely do they pause to consider the woman who stood beside him long before the Exodus ever began. Yet without Zipporah, the story of Moses might have ended before it truly started. Imagine this for a moment. Moses, chosen by God to confront Pharaoh and lead an entire nation to freedom, suddenly finds himself facing divine judgment on the road to Egypt. His life hangs in the balance. In that critical moment, it is not Moses who acts but Zipporah. Her courage, clarity, and swift decision change the course of history. This single, mysterious episode has puzzled scholars for centuries and reveals that Zipporah was far more than a background character in a famous story. She was a woman of insight, strength, and deep spiritual awareness. Zipporah's journey begins in Midian, far from the palaces of Egypt and the camps of Israel. She was not born into the covenant community, yet she came to understand its weight and meaning in a way that proved decisive. As a Midianite woman married to a man called by God, she lived at the crossroads of culture, faith, and destiny. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable but important questions. Who truly understands God's commands? Who steps forward when others hesitate? And how often do we overlook the quiet figures who shape history from the shadows? In this story, we will uncover the hidden depth behind Zipporah's actions, the tension of her marriage to Moses, and the powerful lessons her life still offers today. If you're ready to explore one of the Bible's most intriguing and underrated figures, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover the stories that history often forgets but God never does. She was a Midianite, the daughter of Jethro the priest, and her story enters the biblical narrative at a moment when Moses himself had lost everything, having fled Egypt as a fugitive, stripped of his royal status and uncertain of his future. Moses arrived in the land of Midian as a stranger with no protection, no family, and no clear sense of purpose. It is here, far from the grandeur of Pharaoh's court, that his path crossed with Zipporah's in a setting both ordinary and deeply symbolic, a well in the wilderness. In the ancient world, wells were places of survival, meeting, and transformation. And for Moses, this encounter marked the quiet beginning of a new chapter that would shape the rest of his life. Zipporah was one of the daughters of Jethro, a priest of Midian, a man portrayed in Scripture as wise, respected, and deeply attuned to the divine. When Moses intervened to defend Jethro's daughters from harassment and help them water their flock, his actions revealed a familiar trait, an instinct for justice that had followed him from Egypt into exile. This moment was not dramatic in the way later miracles would be, yet it carried profound meaning. By standing up for Zipporah and her sisters, Moses unknowingly stepped into a household that would shelter him during the long years before his calling fully emerged. Jethro's invitation for Moses to stay was more than an act of hospitality. It was the doorway into a new identity. Marriage to Zipporah sealed Moses' integration into Midianite society. No longer merely a guest, he became family, bound by kinship, responsibility, sovereignty, and shared daily life. Through this union, Moses learned the rhythms of a nomadic existence, tending flocks across harsh landscapes, listening more than speaking, and waiting rather than acting. These years of obscurity were not wasted. They reshaped a man once driven by impulse into one capable of patience and humility. Zipporah, raised within this environment, was not simply accompanying Moses through these years. She embodied the world that was quietly forming him. Her presence anchored him in a life far removed from power and ambition, preparing him for a leadership that would require endurance rather than authority. As the daughter of a priest, Zipporah grew up surrounded by spiritual tradition, ritual, and reverence for God, even if expressed differently from Israelite practice. This background gave her a perspective Moses himself was still learning to integrate. Their marriage became a meeting point of cultures, beliefs, and experiences. Demanding understanding and negotiation rather than dominance. Moses, once shaped by Egyptian power and later called by the God of Israel, now lived within a Midianite household that valued wisdom, order, and faith. This blending of worlds did not weaken his calling, it refined it. During these quiet years in Midian, Moses tended Jethro's flocks, walking the same wilderness paths day after day, while Zipporah shared in the unseen sacrifices of family life. Together, they raised children, built a home, and endured the slow passage of time that often tests faith more than crisis ever could. When God finally called Moses from the burning bush and commanded him to return to Egypt, he did not go as the man he once was. He went as a husband, a father, and a shepherd, shaped by Midian and deeply influenced by the woman he had married there. Zipporah's role in this chapter of Moses' life is subtle but essential. Through marriage, she provided him with belonging when he had none, stability when he was adrift, and a lived experience of faith outside his own heritage. By integrating Moses into Midianite society, Zipporah became part of the preparation process that made his later mission possible. Before Moses could lead a nation, he had to learn how to live among strangers, and before he could stand before Pharaoh, he had to learn humility in the wilderness. Zipporah stood beside him through all of it, not as a distant figure in the background, but as a quiet force shaping the man who would one day change history. Zipporah's cultural and religious background differed from Israel's, creating a quiet but persistent tension that ran beneath the surface of her life with Moses. This tension did not erupt in open conflict, yet it shaped their journey in subtle and powerful ways. As a Midianite raised in the household of Jethro, a priest respected for his wisdom and reverence for God, Zipporah grew up within a spiritual framework that honored the divine while remaining distinct from the covenantal traditions that defined Israel. Her faith was not rooted in the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the same way Moses' calling was, and this difference followed them as an unspoken challenge within their marriage. Living in Midian, Moses was immersed in Zipporah's world long before he returned to Egypt. He learned to see faith practiced not through inherited covenant signs, but through daily devotion, counsel, and ritual shaped by a nomadic culture. Jethro's role as priest suggests an organized spiritual life, one that acknowledged the God of Abraham, while existing alongside broader traditions common in the ancient world. Zipporah, shaped by this environment, carried a spiritual awareness that was practical, grounded, and deeply serious. When Moses eventually encountered God's direct command to return to Egypt, he did so not as an isolated prophet, but as a man whose understanding of faith had already been widened through years of shared life with someone outside Israel's covenant boundaries. When the Israelites finally left Egypt, this contrast between traditions became more visible. The God Moses served demanded exclusive devotion, covenant obedience, and visible signs of faith that marked Israel as distinct. Zipporah, though not born into this covenant, was now bound to it through marriage and motherhood. This placed her in a complex position, standing between two spiritual worlds, fully belonging to neither yet influencing both. The story later reveals moments of shared worship and respect between these cultures, particularly when Jethro meets Moses after the Exodus and offers sacrifices to God alongside Israel's leaders. This scene is striking because it shows that spiritual exchange was possible without erasing difference. Zipporah's family did not stand in opposition to Israel's faith, but interacted with it in ways that brought wisdom, balance, and mutual recognition. Yet tension remained, not always spoken, but deeply felt. Israel's laws repeatedly warned against foreign influence, reflecting a fear that cultural blending could weaken covenant loyalty. Zipporah lived under this shadow, aware that her identity as a Midianite set her apart. Even so, her story challenges the assumption that difference always leads to division. Rather than pulling Moses away from his calling, Zipporah's background sharpened the seriousness of his responsibility. She understood that divine commitment was not merely symbolic, but demanded action, accountability, and respect for sacred boundaries. Her perspective did not dilute the covenant. It exposed the cost of ignoring it. In this way, Zipporah became a living bridge between traditions. She embodied the reality that faith can be recognized, honored, and acted upon even by those outside the original covenant community. Her life demonstrates that spiritual understanding is not confined to ancestry alone, but can be expressed through discernment and decisive obedience. The exchange between Midianite and Israelite traditions within her marriage to Moses was not always comfortable, but it was formative. It forced Moses to confront the weight of his calling, not only as a leader of Israel, but as a husband responsible for guiding his household in alignment with God's demands. As the story unfolds, Zipporah's presence reminds us that God's work often unfolds at the intersection of cultures rather than within isolated boundaries. Her differing background did not disqualify her from playing a meaningful role. Instead, it positioned her to see what others overlooked. Through tension came clarity, and through difference came depth. Zipporah's life quietly testifies that spiritual exchange, when grounded in respect and seriousness, can strengthen faith rather than threaten it, leaving a lasting imprint on the story of Moses and the people he was called to lead. In Exodus 4:24-26, the quiet tensions that had followed Moses and Zipporah through years of shared life suddenly erupted into a moment of terrifying urgency. They were on the road to Egypt, moving forward at last toward the mission God had spoken from the burning bush, when the journey was abruptly interrupted by an encounter that remains one of the most mysterious passages in Scripture. The God who had just chosen Moses as the deliverer of Israel now confronted him in a way that threatened his very life. No explanation is given, no dialogue recorded, only the shocking reality that something essential had been neglected, and the consequences were immediate. At the center of this crisis stood Zipporah, Moses, the prophet, the chosen leader, the man who had spoken directly with God, was suddenly passive in the face of divine judgment. It was Zipporah who recognized what was wrong, and it was Zipporah who acted. Their son had not been circumcised, a sign that marked Israel's covenant with God and symbolized obedience, belonging, and accountability. Sericili. This was not a minor oversight, for the man chosen to lead God's covenant people, failing to uphold this command, undermined the very foundation of his calling. Without hesitation, Zipporah took a flint knife and performed the circumcision herself. The action was decisive, difficult, and deeply symbolic. She did not wait for Moses to recover his voice or seek clarification. She understood the seriousness of the moment and the spiritual weight behind it. In that instant, her understanding of covenant responsibility became unmistakably clear. Though she was not born into Israel's covenant, she grasped its demands with piercing clarity, recognizing that God's calling could not coexist with partial obedience. Her words, often translated as a bridegroom of blood, have been debated for generations, yet their emotional force is undeniable. They reflect the cost of the covenant, a bond sealed not merely by words or identity, but by action and sacrifice. Zipporah's response suggests a mix of pain, urgency, and recognition that this covenant, now binding her family, carried real and uncompromising expectations. Through this act, the threat passed, and Moses' life was spared. The journey resumed, but nothing about it was the same. This moment reveals a striking reversal of expectations. Moses, raised in Egypt, shaped by Midian, and called by God, had momentarily overlooked a core command tied to his identity and mission. Zipporah, the Midianite woman often seen as an outsider, became the instrument through which covenant order was restored. Her action was not symbolic alone. It was corrective. It realigned Moses with the very covenant he was meant to represent before Pharaoh and the people of Israel. The scene also exposes the cost of leadership. Before Moses could confront a king or guide a nation, his own household had to reflect obedience to God's covenant. Zipporah's intervention highlights that spiritual authority cannot bypass personal responsibility. Calling does not excuse neglect, and destiny does not override discipline. In this sense, Zipporah did more than save Moses' life. She preserved the integrity of his mission before it truly began. This episode fits seamlessly into the larger story of Zipporah's life. She had already lived between cultures, navigated spiritual differences, and supported Moses through years of preparation. Here, at the most critical moment, she proved that her understanding of faith was neither shallow nor secondary. She acted where Moses faltered, not out of ambition, but out of awareness. Her courage was not loud, yet it was transformative. After this encounter, Moses continued toward Egypt. Now fully aligned with the covenant, he would soon proclaim to an entire nation. Zipporah's role in this turning point cannot be overstated. In a story often dominated by dramatic signs and divine speeches, it was a single act of obedience, carried out by a woman standing at the margins. that ensured the mission would go forward. This moment stands as a powerful reminder that faithfulness is measured not by position or title, but by the willingness to act when obedience truly matters. Her decisive action shows deep spiritual insight and understanding of covenant obedience, revealing a dimension of Zipporah that goes far beyond her role as Moses' wife. By the time they resumed their journey after that night on the road to Egypt, it was clear that Zipporah was not merely reacting to danger, but responding to a spiritual reality she understood with striking clarity. She recognized that God's calling was inseparable from God's requirements, and that leadership in the divine plan demanded alignment not only in public mission, but in private faithfulness as well. Throughout their life together, Zipporah had lived at the intersection of belief systems. Raised in the household of Jethro, she had been shaped by a form of faith that respected the divine and practiced reverence through ritual, wisdom, and order. Yet through her marriage to Moses, she had also been drawn into the unique weight of Israel's covenant, a bond defined by obedience, visible commitment, and accountability passed down from Abraham. This dual exposure sharpened her spiritual perception. She was able to see what Moses, in that moment of transition and urgency, had overlooked. That moving forward into God's purpose without honoring the covenant sign placed everything at risk. Zipporah's insight was not theoretical. It did not rely on inherited identity or formal authority. It was practical, immediate, and embodied in action. She understood that covenant obedience was not symbolic alone, but required decisive response when obedience was absent. This understanding placed her in a rare position within the biblical narrative. While many figures speak about faith, Zipporah demonstrates it through a difficult act carried out at personal cost. In doing so, she showed that true spiritual awareness is measured not by proximity to power, but by the willingness to act when obedience demands courage. Her theological awareness also reframes the way we understand spiritual leadership within the story of Moses. Though Moses was the one chosen to confront Pharaoh and speak God's words, Zipporah was the one who ensured that his life and mission remained aligned with the covenant. This does not diminish Moses' calling. Instead, it reveals that God's purposes often depend on the faithfulness of those standing just outside the spotlight. Zipporah's role exposes a deeper truth. Spiritual insight is not confined to prophets alone, nor limited by gender, background, or social position. The strength Zipporah displayed was not loud or confrontational. It was steady, discerning, and resolute. She did not challenge Moses' calling, but she did hold him accountable to its requirements. In this way, she functioned as a guardian of covenant integrity within their household. Her action serves as a reminder that faith is not only about responding to God's voice in moments of revelation, but also about honoring God's commands in moments of responsibility. This episode also sheds light on the cost of obedience. Zipporah's words following her action suggest emotional weight, perhaps frustration or pain, yet she did not allow emotion to override obedience. Instead, her response reveals a mature understanding that covenant faithfulness can be demanding and uncomfortable, but never optional. She accepted that being bound to God's plan meant accepting its sacrifices as well. As Moses continued toward Egypt, now fully aligned with the covenant, he would soon declare to Israel. Zipporah's influence lingered in the foundation of that mission. Her strength and theological awareness ensured that the deliverer of Israel would stand before Pharaoh not only as a chosen leader, but as a man whose life was brought back into covenant order. Through this act, Zipporah quietly shaped the integrity of Israel's future. Her story challenges assumptions about who carries spiritual authority and how it is expressed. Zipporah did not speak from a mountaintop or lead a nation, yet her insight preserved a mission that would define an entire people. In the unfolding story of God's covenant, her decisive obedience stands as a powerful testimony that true spiritual strength is revealed not in prominence, but in faithfulness when it matters most. Despite facing cultural and possible racial prejudice, Zipporah remained steadfast in her support of Moses' calling, and it is in this quiet perseverance that her legacy becomes most powerful. She lived much of her life on the margins of Israel's story, never fully belonging, never fully recognized, yet consistently present at its most critical moments. As a Midianite woman married to the leader of Israel, Zipporah carried the weight of being different in a community defined by ancestry, covenant, and identity. That difference, at times, placed her under suspicion and criticism, even from within Moses' own family. Yet the story never portrays her withdrawing, retaliating, or attempting to reshape Moses' mission for her own comfort. Instead, she endured. Zipporah's strength is revealed not through speeches or public authority, but through endurance shaped by wisdom. She navigated a world where faith and identity were tightly bound to heritage, while she herself came from outside that lineage. Moments like the criticism recorded in Numbers, where Moses' wife becomes a point of tension, hint at the unspoken challenges she may have faced daily. Even so, Zipporah did not allow prejudice to define her role or silence her convictions. When obedience was required, she acted. When support was needed, she stood firm. Her loyalty was not blind, but deeply rooted in understanding the seriousness of God's covenant and Moses' responsibility within it. Her story reframes what courage looks like in the biblical narrative. Courage is often imagined as confrontation or conquest, but Zipporah's courage was quieter and more enduring. It was the courage to stand beside a calling that demanded sacrifice, uncertainty, and long seasons of separation. It was the courage to remain faithful in a story where her name appears only briefly, yet her actions echo far beyond the verses that mention her. Zipporah understood that supporting God's work does not always mean standing at the center of attention. Sometimes it means holding everything together when the center begins to crack. Faith, in Zipporah's life, was not inherited by birthright, but embraced through responsibility. She chose to bind herself to the covenant through action, even when that covenant carried pain, tension, and cost. Her wisdom allowed her to see beyond cultural barriers and recognize the deeper purpose unfolding through Moses. She did not compete with his calling, nor did she diminish herself to preserve it. Instead, she strengthened it, ensuring that Moses could move forward aligned with God's expectations. In the end, Zipporah stands as a symbol of what it means to be faithful without recognition, strong without dominance, and wise without public affirmation. Her story reminds us that history is often shaped not only by those who lead from the front, but by those who uphold truth, obedience, and integrity behind the scenes. Without Zipporah, Moses' journey might have ended before it truly began. With her, it continued, grounded in covenant and sustained by courage. Thank you for taking the time to journey through Zipporah's story. If this exploration brought new insight or deeper understanding, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue uncovering the hidden figures and untold moments that shape biblical history.